everyone. My name is Nick Lewis from Internet2. Thanks for joining us today for I2 Online mitigating man-in-the-middle phishing toolkit attacks that bypass multi-factor authentication. I'd like to start out with thank yous to the researchers from Stony Brook, Nick Babak, and then Alex from Palo Alto Networks for agreeing to come and talk about their important research. Having talked with a number of campus information security teams over the last 6 months to a year, I know that there have been a number of campuses that have observed these types of attacks on their campus, but the awareness has been pretty uneven. And so I wanted to improve awareness of this attack that's been really developing over the last two years, but seems to have gotten better over the last year or 6 months. And so we're lucky to have the researchers from to come on for this for a paper from last year to come and talk to the community and help us better understand how it impacts higher education. So I'd like to next slide, please. Start with a little bit of the logistics. Please ask your questions as we go if you have them, or you can queue them up for the end. I'll be monitoring the chat and the QA and asking the questions to our speakers, and then we'll have some time. We've saved time at the end to make sure that we can answer your questions as we go. Just a quick reminder on logistics: everyone's microphones and videos are turned off. If you have any questions after the webinar, please follow up. Feel free to follow up with us at netplus@internet2.edu or contact me. We'll have an interactive discussion at the end, and please ask your questions, because I know there are lots from having talked to the community. Today's virtual event is being recorded and will be made available on the past event portion of the Internet2 I2 Online webpage, reference there. Next slide, please. And I'd like to thank today's virtual event sponsor, Carosoft, that we work with them on a number of NetPlus programs, and they sponsor this webinar. Thank you. And then on to our speakers. And so I'd like to introduce Nick and Babak and let them talk a bit about themselves.
Great. Thank you for having us. So my name is Nick Nikiforakis. I'm an associate professor at Stony Brook University, and I direct the PragSec Lab, which stands for Pragmatic Security. So we try to be active in anything related to web security and privacy. And so this project was combining a lot of interesting dimensions across phishing, network security, web security, fingerprinting. So I hope that there's something in this presentation for everyone. And we do a lot of other research related to privacy, related to honeypots, attack surface reduction, and mobile Android apps and their security and their privacy issues. So by all means, please check out our website after, of course, the end of this presentation. And I'll let Babak introduce himself.
I'm Babak Amin Azad. I'm a PhD candidate at Stony Brook University and also a research assistant at the PragSec Lab. And I'm happy to present our work today to you guys.
So this talk is called Catching Transparent Fish, Analyzing and Detecting Man-in-the-Middle Phishing Toolkits. And it was a collaboration between Brian Kondraki, who's another one of my students who couldn't be here today, and Oleg Sistarov, who was actually my first PhD student at Stony Brook and has graduated to go do great things at Palo Alto Network and is also on the call today and will be able to answer some of your questions. If you're interested in this topic, you can just use your favorite search engine and search for the same title, and you'll find our paper, and you can read that paper, and we also have datasets available, which we will give you links for at the when we finish this talk. So without further ado, let's set up a little bit this presentation. So we all know that there's a lot of value in stolen data, and there is people who go to dark web and search on underground forums and look for prices, and so we have some indication of what stolen data is sold for. So we know, for example, that a Spotify account has in the recent past been sold for about $2.75, right? That a driver's license is sold for 10 times that, because of course it enables a lot more attacks, right? Potential identity thefts. Social security numbers a bit less so by themselves. So we're clearly seeing that there is a market for stolen data. And this slide here is focusing on private companies and data of individual users. But as educational institutions, you know that we're also sitting on treasure troves of data because we have thousands of employees, tens of thousands of students, right? We have everyone's security, social security numbers, we have bank accounts for payroll, grades. There is just a lot of information that is just available for someone to steal if they're able to get into our systems. And ransomware has already been making headway in institutions exactly because of this issue, right? And so if you look there on the right part of the slide, you will see a graph that is comparing instances of phishing and instances of malware over time. And so if you look, for example, we start with malware, the blue line, we're having a lot more incidents like in early 2000s and 2010 compared to phishing. But as time progresses, we see that phishing overtakes and just shoots up like crazy. And this, at least one explanation, has to do with how browsers, modern browsers, have really hankered down on security mechanisms and sandboxes. So it's very difficult to actually do like a drive-by download today compared to what it was in 2012 or 13. So, but effectively, all that this meant is that attackers just shifted their priorities and their focus attacking the user as opposed to attacking the machine, right? Because the users are still vulnerable. And I don't know if they're more vulnerable compared to 10 years ago, but they are clearly vulnerable. And so there's just a lot of instances where you have a perfectly secure browser, but of course the user behind the browser is behaving insecurely. And so you're all familiar with traditional phishing attacks. The components are relatively simple. So in traditional phishing attacks, attackers will just create a copy of a website, either purchase a template or just download a copy of the site by themselves, of the victim site that they're targeting. And then they would effectively set this content on some sort of server that they had access to. And this could be either a compromised web server, so compromising someone's web server and then storing a copy of this phishing site, or potentially obtaining a server of their own in more sophisticated and more spear phishing kind of attacks, right? And at the end of this, you somehow need to drive traffic. The attacker needs to drive traffic to their phishing site. So depending again on who is being targeted, this could be just a blast of emails and a blast of SMSs, or if it's targeted, it can be a very specific email to a very specific person, potentially from a compromised email account, so that the attacker increases their chances of getting the victim to click on that link, right? That said, there are certain limitations for the attacker in traditional phishing, right? The first one is that, of course, implementation errors can lead to detection. The websites that attackers are targeting, they are moving targets, right? PayPal today does not look like PayPal from a month ago, and it certainly doesn't look like a PayPal from a year ago. So the attacker always takes this risk in these traditional phishing attacks that the website doesn't quite look exactly like the victim does. And so a user may potentially observe that there is a difference, right? And go ahead and realize that this is a phishing attack and survive that attack. Web pages update, of course, at increasing speeds. So we have that problem that I just mentioned. We have other detection problems related to broken JavaScript, how we're pulling things from third parties, right? Again, depending on how the attacker sets this up, his website can break in addition to looking different than the original site. And finally, the attacker also suffers from early detection, right? Because you have, of course, as you know, entire industries that are focused on detecting these phishing sites as fast as possible, right? And so the second that they detect this phishing site, this will be added to one more block lists, which will be propagated on client devices and various network security boxes. And so at that point, the attacker is just no longer receiving traffic to his website, even if that website is still online, right? So we have these quote unquote limitations that attackers have to deal with. And so this brings us to the most recent evolution in the phishing space, which are man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits. And the key differentiator compared to the past way of doing phishing is that the attacker is no longer getting a static copy of a website and deploying it on a server. As you can see there on this slide on the graph, the attacker's server is actually acting like a reverse proxy. So when the user goes to the phishing site, the proxy is immediately replaying that request to the real victim site, getting that response, rewriting it, and then sending it to the victim, right? And so pretty much the attacker is brokering all communications back and forth between client and server. And these enables a lot of powerful capabilities for the attacker, right? Because you have websites that are always up to date, because where the attacker is pulling that website live right now. The website will work pre-authentication and post-authentication. So the user will never realize that something is broken, he can just log into the phishing site and use it exactly as he would use the real site. And in that sense, the lifetime of the attack increases, right? And while we're doing this, the attacker, of course, can steal everything in transit, right? So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. The attacker is not breaking encryption, right? It's not like they found a way to abuse the TLS protocol. We have two separate sessions, as you can see in steps 1 and 2 on this slide. We have the TLS session between the victim user and the server, and a separate TLS session between that server and the victim server, between the malicious server and the victim server, right? So the attacker is able to inspect everything in clear text, overwrite anything that he wants, and the victim user is happy that he's browsing the web over HTTPS, and the server is happy that he's talking to a real, as far as the server is concerned, client, again over HTTPS. So credential is stolen in transit, and not only credentials, but also multi-factor authentication cookies, right? Because everything is done live, when the user logs in, and now the server sends back an MFA challenge, the attacker just listens, right? The user will receive an SMS code on their phone, or will open up their authenticator app. They will type in their code into the phishing site. That code will go through the attacker server, which is not that code is not particularly interesting, but that code will be replayed to the real server. And from that point forward, the user has a cookie that is multi-factor authenticated. And the attacker also has that cookie, right? So from that point onward, the attacker is able to do any kinds of requests that he wants to the website as a multi-factor authenticated user, right? And abuse this however he wants, and according to the logic available to the website. And so there is one very popular tool. I see we have a question. Let me finish these tools, and then I'll see if I can answer that question. So we have 3 popular tools. There's one, the most popular one is EvilGeneX, which is effectively turns all of this into a turnkey operation. Just download a piece of software and it does all of this automatically for you. And we also have Murayana and Modlishka, which are also quite advanced and quite sophisticated, but less popular than EvilGeneX. And we will show you a video of a demo of EvilGeneX in the next slide. Let me check out the question that we got. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to read it off for you. What if a push is used instead of a code entry?
So this will have the same effect, right? Because the user is really trying to log in. So let's say that they get a notification on their phone that says, "Are you trying to log in?" And the user will say, "Yes, I am." He's trying to log in the phishing site, but he's still trying to log in. So once you say, "Yes, I am," the real server, the victim server, then assigns to your current session an MFA status. And the attacker already has access to that session because he's that man in the middle, right? So as long as the attacker is able to obtain that multi-factor authenticated cookie, he can effectively perform this attack, right? So there's no difference for the attacker as far as he's concerned.
Then there's a follow-up. The push would not show the correct location, though, likely.
That's a good point, and it really depends on the sophistication of the attacker, right? There is nothing really stopping you. Again, depending on who we are targeting. If I'm targeting a very specific person, I will put my EvilGeneX box in the same geographical location as that person, and so this will match that person's location. So
that's right. So in some of the campus attacks discussions that I've had that have been TLP Amber, they have had attackers use a peer-to-peer VPN to show up on the network of that campus, and so it'll show the right. If your app shows just a city, it'll show the right city. Exactly. For geolocation, or it may show the right IP address range, which obviously makes it very challenging.
Right. Yes. So the geolocation could save the day, but it doesn't. It's not necessary that it will, because the attacker can always geolocate himself in the right place. So let us show you a quick demo, again, a video demo of the tool of EvilGeneX in action, in case you haven't seen this before. So effectively, on the left, we will have the victim's view, and on the right, we have the terminal, which is just showing you the tool in action. Again, I don't know how large this is for you, but I'll try to narrate as much as possible. Here you see on the right, we have the attacker who will start the EvilGeneX tool. He will decide that we're trying to set up a phishing site for GitHub, so he will just select the ready-made template for GitHub. And the attacker configures the tool just pretty much by giving it the IP address of the server. And then actually the tool itself will go out and it will get a Let's Encrypt certificate. So the server that will spin up on the attacker's machine will have an HTTPS will have a TLS certificate, and the user will be able to interact with that server over HTTPS. So everything looks good protocol-wise as far as the user is concerned. And so we will now see in a second, this will create a link that the attacker will be able to effectively try to attract traffic to. And we can see here what will happen if we try to visit this directly in the browser. And the first thing that you will see is actually it will be redirected, because these tools have evasion capabilities built in. So unless you don't just need the right domain, but you also need a specific token in the file path in order to get access to that phishing site, right? And so now, so you can't sort of accidentally discover it. That's the idea here. So now we will see how things look like if the user visits the full URL as a victim that the attacker somehow gets them to click on. So on the left here, you see GitHub, and this is now a phishing site. It's actually coming from a server that is controlled by the attacker, and it's a perfect imitation of GitHub because the server is acting like a reverse proxy, man in the middling all of the requests and responses. And now you see actually a question for the MFA. So the user gets, in this case, the MFA in an email and will copy paste that into the phishing site. And of course, this all makes sense from the user's perspective. They're trying to log in, they are being sent an MFA, and they're copy pasting the MFA on the side that they're trying to log in, right? So this works perfectly. There's nothing odd in this workflow. And so now the user will log in. This all goes now to the attacker, through the attacker. And now you can see on the left that the user is actually is able to browse the authenticated GitHub as a specific account. Everything is working. And in the meantime, the attacker now has stolen the username, the password, and has a copy of that authenticated cookie, which, as you can see here, we can print them out, and we have the username and the password, the credentials, and the token that the attacker can use, and the remote IP address of that client in case we want to use this for geolocating ourselves now or in the near future, right? So you can see that this is very powerful, and it's all turnkey, right? So what is our
Nick,
yes.
I've got a couple questions.
Sure,
so going back to the when you were showing the you talked about some templates that attackers can use, like for GitHub and things like
yes.
that. Have you seen any templates that have been developed for targeting higher education? There's a couple pieces of software that are extremely popular, Shibboleth and Kaz. Have you seen any templates?
That's an excellent question. I haven't looked for them, so. What I should say about these tools is that these tools are advertising themselves as penetration testing tools, right? So that's the idea there. And you can go to the GitHub accounts. That these things, it's not like you need to buy them on the underground market. They're open source. You can download them, right? But effectively, this is a very powerful tool that, of course, can be just as easily used for offensive purposes by attackers as for penetration testing purposes. And so the makers of these tools actually have a lot of templates available freely on their website. And we know actually that on the underground now, people are selling templates for sites that the developer is not supporting himself, right? They're not popular enough, and attackers are actually making templates and then are selling them on the underground. So it's very likely that that these software that you mentioned, that there are templates for it, if someone just knows where to look for it.
Excellent, thank you. One of the things that, from a campus perspective, trying to investigate one of these sites, they may use like wget or curl to try to get access. They may not have the token code that you mentioned to be able to investigate that, to see what's going on. Any way from a incident response investigation perspective you can see
right. So if you just use like wget or curl that you mentioned, you will get evaded because you will be missing the token and you will be redirected to a site that the attacker wants. Now, you are welcome to try to use our tool, which we will cover in the second half of this talk, that effectively does some interesting, analysis of the communication to tell you that this site is most likely a a man-in-the-middle phishing kit.
Excellent, thanks. And then last question. We've had there've been some attacks where they've depending on the MFA solution, they may send a token via SMS message that a user types in, or that they copy by manually. They type in a 6-digit code or 4-digit code, and we've seen those tokens captured by phishers and then reused at a later date, because depending on the solution, they may be time-based versus event-based codes, and so sometimes those codes don't expire for quite a while.
Right.
Did you see anything like that?
So what the attackers are doing is that they're actually targeting the most advanced kind of MFA that you can use, the ones that are expiring, right? This attack is all happening online. So the victim is on the line, and the victim user is on the line, the victim server is on the line, and the attacker is in the middle. So effectively, if there are tokens that are valid for days, that makes the attacker's life much more easier, right?
That's right.
The tools are actually solving the harder problem, which are the very temporary tokens that are only valid for 60 seconds.
Thank you.
Sure thing. All right. So let's look at the threat model here, right? The attacker controls all of the application layer, right? Because he's operating that reverse proxy. He can change anything that he wants to change. And he already gets cloaking for free through these tools, right? Which effectively restricts access unless you know that full exact URL with a special token, right? So he can also survive unwanted scanning effectively, right? So therefore, based on these, we understand that detection cannot rely on the integrity of the application layer content, right? There's nothing on the page that we can say, oh, look, this is, I'm looking this page and this is what makes this phishing site. You can't do that. All of that is under the control of the attacker, right? So what we did in this work, and we think it's quite a novel deviation from past work, is we're actually fingerprinting the server as opposed to fingerprinting the content, right? We are turning the advantages of these tools into disadvantages, because they're running all of the specialized software, we're not trying to sort of look at the HTML of sites and tell you that this is phishing. We're actually looking at the network stack and tell you that this is a phishing site, right? And that's what we will cover in the remainder of the talk. So this network architecture, like I just mentioned, it can be leveraged to discover the presence of toolkits. And we use a number of techniques. Among others, we use network timing analysis, and we use TLS fingerprinting. And we will cover this at a high level, and you can look into our paper for all the details. And the fingerprint is actually possible from both ends. So you, as a client, can detect that you're interacting with a phishing kit, and the target web server, let's say PayPal or an education institution, can detect that the client that's currently logging in is most likely a phishing kit, right? So there is power here in both ends. And so let me give you the intuition of network timing analysis. If you look there on the left, we have a direct connection. So we just have a client and a server like you regularly have. You have the client that is sending a SYN packet, right? You have a three-way handshake happening, and then we have the GET. And it's the same client, the same server. So if you look at the time T1 for our three-way handshake, and the time T2 for our first GET request and the first response to that GET request, these are roughly similar, right? If you look on the right, the T1 between the client and the reverse proxy, the malicious reverse proxy, has one value. But when the client now sends a GET request, that GET request arrives at the reverse proxy, and the reverse proxy now needs to do a new three-way handshake with the real victim server, and then send that HTTP request, wait for the response, potentially rewrite it, and then replay it back. So if you look at T2, T2 is much, much larger, right, than T2 in the original scenario. So if we now compare this fraction of T2 and T1, we can know that something is weird, right? We're interacting with something that has an odd delay on the HTTP protocol that was not there during our CNAG handshake, right? And I have a number here of CDFs that I will probably just skip over just to make sure we stick on time. Effectively, you can just look at different types of these tools, the Evulginex, the Modlishka, the Muraena. You can compare the ratios for the GET ratio compared to the SYN packet, the timing, the GET error compared again to SYN. And what is important for you to be able to see is that the non-direct there's always a difference between the non-direct and all the other solid lines and dotted lines, right? So we can capitalize on these differences to be able to come up with features to detect these using timing analysis. And the second thing is TLS fingerprinting, which is becoming slowly one of the tools that I love quite a bit. And man in the middle essentially utilizes, and these phishing kits, they utilize unusual TLS stacks, right? So you are expecting to speak with an Apache web server, you're expecting to speak with an Nginx server, and you're actually speaking with a Ruby on Rails thing. right? So this Ruby on Rails thing has a very odd support of cipher suites and TLS versions. So these are highly, highly uncharacteristic of the general web, right? So now we have extra features that we can tap into, right, and detect that we're talking to something that doesn't appear quite kosher, right? So for our study, we needed, as you will see, we use machine learning to do this detection, but we needed Groundtruth. And because we were the first one to do this, there was no Groundtruth, right? There's no data set out there that says this is 1,000 phishing sites operated based on these tools. So what we did is effectively we built our own testbed infrastructure where we used Amazon Web Services to effectively locate target servers and victim clients and reverse proxies kind of everywhere and anywhere in the world in order to be able to get these timings between them, right? So we have timings when the client and the attacker is located in the same continent. We have timings when the client is located in the US and the attacker is located in Europe and the victim is located in Asia. So we have all sorts of timings, all of these, T1s and T2s that I mentioned earlier, that we can actually use in our machine learning tools. And so through by obtaining this data set and training a relatively simple random forest classifier on this, we achieve quite high accuracy, as you can see, 99.9% with a very high 5-fold cross-validation, right? So again, the timings in these tools are highly uncharacteristic of the general activity on the web, right? And the TLS stack that I just mentioned. So we are taking advantage of all of that in order to detect them. And so with that, I will let Babak present how we operationalized all of these techniques and what we found with them.
Right, thank you, Nick. So with all that great introduction, I think we all know by now that man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits are out there and they are a real threat. So let me tell you about PHOCA, our framework to detect man-in-the-middle phishing websites. So we built this framework to collect the network layer data, including the network timings and the TLS fingerprints to fingerprint and detect these phishing websites. And the name PHOCA comes from the Latin word for seal, which these animals are known to use vibrations in the water to detect their prey, the fish. This is the general architecture of our tool. So in the first step on the left, we need sources of URLs that potentially contain phishing websites. So we use two main sources for that. First is the certificate transparency logs. These are the logs that are populated whenever a website requests an SSL certificate. And on top of that, we use the URL feeds from popular phishing block lists. And the idea there is that if the website is already reported for phishing through various means, are there man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits included in that list or not? And specifically for the certificate transparency logs, because we cannot crawl all the websites that request a certificate out there, we focused on popular trademarks. So we looked for phishing domains that were trying to look like Chase and Google and Instagram and these different popular websites. So after we had the source of URLs, we added them to a queue, and then we had a scheduler and a list of workers which can take these URLs one by one. They have automated browsers, so they would go to these websites and they have integrated PHOCA inside of them, through which they collect these fingerprints and pass them through the machine learning model to tell us if they're likely man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits or not. And on top of that, we also collect other information, traces, IP addresses, screenshots, and whatnot. So there are two main scenarios for which, we send that information over and we analyze them. And then for certain cases, we need to recrawl these websites. One main scenario is that whenever we see a URL pop up in the certificate transparency log, that's the time where the attacker requested an SSL certificate. Now, there may be a delay between the time they get the certificate and they set up their tools. So if we just go to their website, we may see nothing because the phishing is not there yet. So we have this scheduler so that we keep going back until a certain amount of time to make sure that if they set up the phishing site later, we catch that. And the second scenario is that whenever we find a phishing website being deployed, we want to know for how long they stay online. And this information is important because if, let's say the toolkits only operate for the duration of the week and they are taken down by the attackers, our mitigation tools have to match the pace to detect them. So we looked at these sources on the web and looked for the presence of these phishing toolkits. We collected the data for the period of a year from the March of 2020 to the March of 2021. And during that period, we collected the data for over 840,000 web pages, and within them, we identified 1,220 man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits. So now talking about the graphs on the bottom, for the first graph on the left, you see that each month we see a steady number between 60 to 100 something phishing man-in-the-middle phishing websites. In the middle, we see their distribution, the geographic distribution, and we can see that they are kind of evenly distributed wherever the popular cloud service providers are located. So US, Europe, and Asia. And over on the right on the table, we see that indeed, the IP addresses belong to these cloud service providers, including Amazon, DigitalOcean, Microsoft, and whatnot. Okay, I have a question. Do you want me to?
Yep. How do you choose when to evaluate a site?
Right. So we monitor these lists as soon as we have a URL that looks like matches our patterns for phishing to these popular trademarks. We go to those websites. Then through the scheduler, we decide over a period to keep going back to them. And if, let's say, for a duration of a day, we don't see any phishing or any malicious activity, we give up on them. If we see a phishing, we keep going to them. And I discuss those details and those numbers and periods in later slides.
Excellent, okay. Thanks. I'm wondering about the, actually, I'll let you get back to that and I'll follow up with some more EDU specific questions after the next thing. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so then we looked at these popular trademarks and see which of them are targeted more often. And we see that, for example, Instagram and Google are over on the top with over 200, around 300 different campaigns targeting them. And looking at the sample domains for each of these websites, we see interesting patterns. So for example, one of the domains that we found impersonating Instagram is m.logins-instagram.ga. Or for Google, we see accounts.google-2fa.com. So you could see that from the user's perspective, this could be, seen as a legit domain, given all the, interactions that these tools do as a follow-up. So it's not easy really for users to detect these tools. Then we looked at the build of these URLs. So how are they generated? Here we have three main categories of phishing URL types. First, we have the combo squatting. And in this type of attack, let's say, you combine the trademark of your target, let's say Facebook, with some other trustworthy names like Facebook login, Facebook 2FA, Facebook secured, things like that. Then we have target embedding, where you use your target trademark somewhere in the domain, usually a subdomain. So this would be login.facebook.phishingdomain.com. And finally, we have typo squatting, where you replace certain characters of your target domain with others, with the hope that the user makes a typo and types a J instead of a K because they're next to each other on the keyboard and ends up coming to your website. And based on that, we see that the majority of the domains are using combo squatting and target embedding. And that's most likely because these tools are used to target specific individuals. They're not spray and pray type of attacks. So they don't have as much use for typo squatting. Their main goal is to seem legit to their victims. Next, we looked at the life cycle of phishing websites. So for how much time does it take for them to come online and for what duration they stay online. So over on the left, we see the time prior to our detection when their domain was registered, the phishing domain. And we see that the majority of these phishing domains were registered fresh and they were deployed soon after. With some exceptions, a few number of them were old domains that were potentially reused for a new attack. Next, we looked at the phishing websites and the time between they request the TLS certificate and we see the URL and certificate transparency logs to the time that we actually see the phishing kit being, operational. And again, we see that more than 90% of these tools become online within the same hour that we see the certificate. But if you want to have a scheduler that keeps going back to those websites for up until 24 hours, you could see the majority of them that would come online. And finally, we wanted to see for how long these phishing URLs remain operational. And again, the majority of them are only operational for a short period of time, with only 20% of them remaining active after 10 days. And this is mostly because these are likely targeted attacks. They do the operation, they take the website down. And then finally, we looked at the presence of these malicious domains and IP addresses of these web servers on the popular block lists, seeing whether using these block lists help us prevent access of the victims to these domains. As it turns out, only 43% of these domains and less than 20% of these IP addresses appear on the block lists. We already know the limitations of block lists, but given the cloaking capabilities of these tools, this is further exacerbated.
Excellent. Thanks, Babak. Before we go on to the case study, a couple questions. So I know you didn't look at any EDU specific things. You look at the top ones. What I'm wondering is, let's say you wanted to replicate this study looking at just EDU domains. Is it just basically adding a pattern into looking for the EDU essentially in .edu and the domains in your the part of the tool that looks at the certificate transparency lists and the block lists? How would you go about if you wanted to extend it to look at the EDU sector?
Exactly. That's one of the better approaches, I would say. So here we looked for 22 popular trademarks. You can do the same. We have the tools to generate the potential phishing URLs for your target domain. This can be your EDU domains. And then you look for the presence of those certificates on the certificate transparency logs. You also have the traces on the network. So if you have an existing firewall, it raises an alert for an existing malicious domain. Then you can also use PHOCA to see if a man-in-the-middle phishing attack was going on there or not.
And so you could just basically take one of those, a campus could take that URL and use the PHOCA tool to check it themselves. And so they could do the same step themselves.
True, exactly, yeah.
And could they, so in the higher education community, there's the REN ISAC, they have a threat intelligence feed. Could a campus or somebody look at that threat intelligence feed and do a similar type of analysis?
Yes, so any source of information, the fish tanks of the world, or specific ones for educational systems. And I think before we discussed one of the certificate authorities that works with educational institutions. So that can also be a separate, source of information. The certificates are most likely going to show up on the certificate transparency log, but maybe you want to put more emphasis on those domains if you have a limited, crawling capability to protect campuses. At the same time, if campuses use other popular software like G Suite to manage their, file storage or their inboxes, they can, be monitored as well. And part of the Gmail and Google attacks could as well be targeting educational institutes in our data set.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question in the chat. How does the attacker's use of tokenized URLs, which you mentioned earlier, affect your ability to detect a reverse proxy site?
Right. So on a traditional phishing detection setup, if you don't have online detection, you take these feeds of URLs from a source, and then you send the crawler to go to these websites and take a screenshot, look at the visual aspects and other cues on the website. And if you don't have the token, you don't see any content, so you cannot find anything. If you have inline scanners, they can obviously see the content, so then some of your visual detection, page structure detection can work. But with PHOCA, the real power is that these web servers have to first respond to you to see if you have a token or not. And all of these TLS fingerprinting and network timing actually happens before they decide to show you the cloaked page and turn you away or give you the actual phishing content. So using PHOCA, you don't need to have the token. You can still detect them based on the fingerprints that you collect.
Excellent, thank you. I got a question in the QA. How could an institution set up alerts for TLS certificate creation matching certain keywords like an EDU name?
So there's different sources of certificate transparency logs. For example, Google has one source. You can subscribe to domains. Some of them, you tell them your original trademark, and they look for these mutations of the domain for you and alert you. For some of them, you can get the list yourself, use the existing tools that is also built into PHOCA to generate these mutations, the combo squatting and typo squattings, and then look for the presence of them yourself. But they may as well be other tools out there that you can use. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So on top of our study in the wild, we also collaborated with Alto networks to do a case study to see how prevalent are these attacks from their perspectives on their clients. So they deployed PHOCA on their defensive system, and they identified that 56% of the phishing domains marked by PHOCA were also marked as malicious by their inline scanners. And 15% of those labels came at least 1 week after the initial discovery. So you can clearly see the room for improvement where PHOCA can come into play and increase your detection power. And this information was found to be affecting 6,400 customer requests, which were targeted towards 260 phishing websites over the 6-month period. And these reports were collected from 368 distinct firewall devices. So what can we do? For mitigations, one thing that we can do is to have our Gmails and PayPals of the world, the web servers, the service providers, perform server-side TLS fingerprinting to detect that the login attempt is not actually from a benign user, is from one of these man-in-the-middle toolkits. And as Nick mentioned earlier, these toolkits do not utilize common web client TLS stacks. What this means is that their TLS stack is going to be different than, let's say, a Chrome browser on a MacBook. But what happens is that these tools, in order to look realistic, they forward the HTTP headers, including the user agent of the original user, to the target server. So they're claiming, the user agent is claiming that they're Chrome on a MacBook, but the TLS fingerprint is saying that they're Go HTTP library. And this information can indeed be used to detect them. So to address this part, we use the JAW3 TLS fingerprinting library, which essentially takes the hash of the values and the order of the cipher suites and the signature algorithms in the TLS client hello of these tools and hashes them to build a unique fingerprint. And now the question is, do these fingerprints look like any benign tools or browsers out there, or are they unique? And to address that, we purchased 13,000 advertising impressions on a popular advertising service to collect user information and TLS fingerprint. And through that, we collected 163 unique TLS fingerprints of browsers, popular browsers, from 4,300 distinct HTTP user agents. And indeed, the fingerprints of these man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits were unique in this data set, meaning that it is safe to lock these tools or use this idea to identify that the login attempt is from these tools and not a benign user. And now moving on to the countermeasures from the user's perspective or the client's perspective. So what can users do? Well, first of all, like any other phishing attack, the users can analyze the primary domain that they're interacting with to see if there's anything suspicious. And I firmly believe that by raising the awareness about the presence of these tools, just because you could log in and see your emails in the inbox, or just because you're using the 2FA to log in doesn't mean that you're secure. You should still be aware that these attacks can happen, and that may help you identify that something odd is going on. And on top of that, we have these protocols already, like the U2Fs and FIDOs, that allow you to use a second factor of authentication that actually uses public key cryptography, which in theory, if deployed correctly, prevents the attacker from being able to sit in the middle and grab or replay this code to get the authentication cookie. And finally, for online services and anti-phishing entities, they can look for these discrepancies in the client TLS fingerprints, as we mentioned, and they can also use the network layer detection techniques that we talked about, or just use PHOCA to search for these phishing websites and block them quickly before they can hurt users. So in conclusion, we saw that man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits allow attackers to launch highly effective phishing attacks. Their unique architecture, which is that they have to sit in the middle and proxy everything, allows us to fingerprint them at the network layer. And during this time, this study over a year, we found 1,220 man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits operating in the wild and targeting real users. And the anti-phishing ecosystem, including the block lists, do not effectively capture man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits. So we need to raise the awareness and integrate PHOCA-like tools to increase our visibility into these attackers. And our code and data is available in this domain, caching transparent fish with dashes in between .github.io. You can take this, you can use this on your sources of information. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk, and I'm happy to take questions together with Nick and Alex. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Babak. There's some comments about a Python Duo Labs Python tool generating lookalike possibilities. Then I had a question sent in advance. Microsoft, Apple, and Google announced plans to support FIDO passwordless login standard developed by W3C and the FIDO Alliance. The new standards will allow users to authenticate with PINs or biometric information and sign into an app or service on nearly any device. Will the use of this new standard provide safeguards against account takeovers and reverse proxy man-in-the-middle MFA phishing attacks?
I can take that. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so the way these protocols work is that you have this private key on your device, and you use that to authenticate with the web server. Now, they have extra protections like the biometrics, like you use your fingerprint to unlock this, but we have to bear in mind that these fingerprints and these biometrics never leave the device, so they're not actually any different than having a PIN locally. But then what happens is that you use public key crypto. Now, if the attackers are able to somehow capture that and replay that towards a server, all they need is to get the authentication cookie that comes back as a response. So once you do that authentication once, the rest with your following request only need to have the authentication cookie. So if they capture that, it doesn't matter if you have FIDO. But one of the concepts, design concepts built into FIDO and many of the other older protocols is called channel binding. The idea is that your crypto operations are bound to your existing TLS channel. So they cannot reuse that for the second leg of the connection between the man-in-the-middle toolkit and the target web server to get the authentication token. So yes, with the correct implementation of these tools, you are protected against man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits.
I've talked with a number of campuses about the challenges for FIDO, and and the deployment aspects that we can do is a whole different webinar some other time. Any other questions from the audience? There's a question in the chat. Currently, we rely on a homebrew analysis tool to process reported phishes and add to block lists. We run this manually. I presume this tool will not detect normal, not man-in-the-middle phishing toolkits as well?
Yes, that is correct, because we're effectively, we will be able to tell you that you're interacting with one of these tools. We don't know what this tool is serving, right? We don't care what this tool is serving. We just know that you're interacting with an evil Nginx or a Murana. So indeed, if you're dealing with a traditional phishing site sitting on an Apache server, that will be, that will not be marked by PHOCA.
Thank you. And one of the future sort of looking attacks or recent attacks, there's an attacker that's using no VNC to do that man-in-the-middle. And I got to imagine that the time difference between that you were talking about earlier would be huge for that type of.
Exactly. Anything that effectively involves the attacker relaying content will add these, unexpected delays on the second leg of the communication.
And the comment in the chat was thinking about how to implement more automation from the campus perspective to be able to potentially use your tool as part of their automation. That could really help with getting those sites identified and blocked.
Right. Yeah, and something that that Babak answered earlier, effectively the question about certificate transparency. There are, for people who like to write code, there are open source solutions that allow you to tap into the constant stream of certificate transparency announcements. And then you can effectively, you can have your own logic about what kinds of domains that you look for. And for every hit in your list, then you can send crawlers, you can send PHOCA, you can do whatever you want. You can have an analyst look at it. So certificate transparency is a big source of intelligence, and we would encourage people to use it who are not currently using it.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I'll ask another one while people are thinking of their last questions. So you'd mentioned be able to run this on a campus border firewall, potentially in the case study section. So any sort of nuances around a campus, just basically turning that on if they have one of those firewalls, to be able to start doing detections on at least on the devices that are on their local network.
Right. So, I mean, we understand that effectively, educational institutions are a bit of a very peculiar type of organization, right? Because you can't just do like TLS termination, because you don't control the actual devices. It's a bring your own device by default, right? So that's the default. So you just need a source of domains, and this could be effectively coming from your recursive DNS server. This could be coming from your from scanning of incoming email addresses, from scanning of email addresses, of email messages. So any source that is available, despite the bring your own device aspect, any source that gives you access to the domains and or the URLs that the students go to and the employees go to, these can then be used as an input source to PHOCA and other similar tools for scanning purposes.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question. How long does it take for PHOCA to check a typical domain?
It's in the order of seconds. So of course you can run as many PHOCAs as you want in parallel, right? But there is, we have to take into account the specifics of the TLS protocol and how we do the fingerprinting of the TLS stack. And that's a little bit what quote unquote slows us down. So if you need to have a lot of throughput, you would need to run hundreds or thousands of PHOCAs in parallel, that then you don't mind waiting a few seconds on each one to respond to you.
So maybe doing this in real time might be a challenge.
Yes, I think so. So that is most likely going to be too slow. But of course, to a certain extent, the end-to-end attack takes a while, right? The user needs to go on the site, mistakenly accept the site as true, try to log in, get the MFA thing. So this all we're talking about, we're in the tens of seconds at this point.
That's right.
So if you fired PHOCA, the very first second you saw that request, you could very well intercept the attack before its end.
And you probably would catch it before the second person.
Right, right, exactly.
Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to thank Nick and Vivek for presenting on this webinar and helping to improve awareness of this issue across the broader ecosystem around multi-factor authentication. Thank you so much. Really great webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and your questions. And lastly, I'd like to thank Carosoft for sponsoring this webinar. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me or the NetPlus team, and we can get you in touch with the right team to answer your question. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.